Welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Commercial Real Estate 101 Meetup Group. For those of you guys who are tuning in for the first time, we started this group back in August of 2020, kind of in response to COVID. People were kind of not really getting together to talk about commercial real estate topics. So we started to look for ways to be able to convene in some capacity as far as online was concerned. And, that's kind of where it stemmed from. And ever since then, we've been inviting speakers on a bi-weekly basis to talk about a variety of different commercial real estate topics. And today we have the honor and privilege to have a friend of mine who's local to Louisville, Brian Lee with Stites Harbison. They're a local firm. And I mean, you guys are pretty large here in Louisville. I believe you also have, I don't know if you have branches outside of just the Louisville area, but he specializes in the commercial leasing side from a legal standpoint. And so I'm excited to kind of dive in and learn a little bit more about the commercial leasing process. So welcome, Brian.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Stites Harbison, we actually have offices throughout the southeast of the country. So yeah, we're regional.
Oh, that's awesome. No, yeah, I know. I figured you guys have a huge presence here in Louisville. And obviously you guys do a ton of work for clients, not just here in Kentucky. You have clients all over the country. So, I think you guys are going to be able to provide a ton of value to the discussion. So what we typically do when we first get started with these discussions is we like to learn a little bit more about the person that's across the table from us. So if you don't mind kind of sharing your story, I think that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks again for the introduction. Well, my name is Brian Lee. I was born and raised in New York City. I am a fourth generation New Yorker. Went to college at SUNY Binghamton, law school at Fordham University. Practiced in New York for about 4 years, primarily focusing in commercial real estate and also high-end residential. I moved to Louisville in January 2021. After my wife Jessica and I got married. She's a local Louisvillian, so it just kind of made sense for me to move here. But yeah, now I'm with the real estate group at Stites Harbison and loving Kentucky.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I met you guys. Obviously I met Jessica ahead of time. I'm in the commercial brokerage space, and we just kind of crossed paths. And she's actually the one who got me into the brokerage that I'm at right now, because she had done a deal with one of the agents in her office, and she introduced me to my broker. And so that's just kind of how it all intertwined. And that's kind of cool. The cool thing about Louisville, it's just a very tight knit community, and you can kind of, you're not too far removed from, a variety of different people. So.
Absolutely. Especially in the real estate space, I feel like.
Oh, absolutely.
She's a realtor, just for context. I don't think I said that.
No, you did. You mentioned it. She's a real estate agent as well in town. So definitely. So one thing that, I'm sure some people have a question about is what is a commercial real estate attorney? Because, obviously, you have, closing attorneys that handle a lot of residential transactions versus other types of attorneys that handle commercial real estate transactions. And also there's the leasing side, there's the development side, et cetera. So can you kind of elaborate a little bit on what exactly the nuances are for commercial real estate attorneys?
Sure. I think my job, I think there's a little bit more due diligence. With just a closing attorney, it's really just about the transaction, one and done. Maybe there's less of a relationship unless you have repeat clients who are closing multiple properties for you. But I think on the commercial end, it's more of an ongoing relationship, because once you acquire a property and once you, I'm assuming usually owners will obtain financing. So there's lender concerns there throughout the length of the loan as you sign leases. I mean, you're the owner of the property. You've got stuff going on with this asset, for years, as long as you hold it. So I think, once you have an attorney who is, familiar with your property, helped you acquire it, it's just a bit more streamlined to stick with the same person if the relationship works. That's probably one of the main differences, just the nature of the relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know. And especially on the leasing end, like you said, I mean, you're going to be with these individuals probably for the rest of their careers a lot of times. And when you start dealing with the volume that you guys are doing, you guys work with REITs and you work with a lot of larger companies that own properties all across the nation. You start getting into these, very different intricacies of the lease agreements, and trying to think of different ways that you can, make sure that your client's best interests are being kept and met. And so, I definitely, that's one of the things that I talk to, my clients about in particular, because a lot of times they just may decide they want to try to go with an attorney that they've used in the past for other means, but there really is a very distinct difference about what the purview of those individuals that are just strictly commercial real estate attorneys they are. And so I always encourage people to, focus on the discipline, because if you do estate planning, you're not going to really know how to elaborate on a 50-page, grocery store lease, and what are the nuances involved with that type of transaction. So that's awesome. So one of the questions that I had for you was pertaining to, what are some of the questions you typically ask a client prior to starting to work with them? Because, this is something that I do, not on the legal end, but, when I'm starting to work with clients, there's definitely a list of things that I try to get a feel for so that I can get a better understanding of what they're looking for. And then, ultimately also make sure that they understand the road that they're about to traverse. So if you can kind of share, some of the insights pertaining to some of the things that you ask when you first start working with a client, I think that'd be great.
Sure. I think, other than running standard conflict checks in the beginning, I think my process would be a little similar to yours, maybe not as in depth, but I would like to know more about, my client's business, what their goals are. I just want, like, the more that I know about how I can better serve and what my client's goals are, I mean, it would affect the way that I would read the lease and, read with particular considerations in mind. And I think, just the more I have to work with, the better value I can add. So I guess that would be the first bucket of questions. And then I'd also want to know, like, what level of involvement they will want from me. I mean, everyone is cost conscious. We don't want to, I don't want to work more than what the client wants to pay for. And, sometimes I might just be asked to read through the lease and see if I see any red flags, and they're ready to sign like now. Other times they might want a summary of all the important points and maybe focus on not renegotiating, but, focusing on tweaking one or two top issues. Other times I'm told to have at it, mark up as much as I can, make this as tenant friendly, or if I'm representing the tenant, or, make it as client friendly as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know we saw each other just yesterday at an event, and he was talking about how one of the deals that he's working on was a REIT, and they're having him go through all these different types of lease abstracts and stuff like that. So to your point, I mean, each client's going to have their own desires and what they want from their attorney, and to be able to, make sure that you align and understand what their expectations are is definitely, I'm sure, of importance. So that's some great insight. So one of the things that I typically like to ask, and this is the reason why I like to ask this, is because I run into this in my practice a lot here. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure that people are muted. But this is one of the things that I run into my practice a lot as well, is that, people don't think about certain provisions within a lease agreement that could impact them negatively, especially on the tenant end. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, what are some of the provisions business owners fail to consider as they're reviewing commercial lease agreements? Because, there's some commercial lease agreements that are, 2-3 pages long, and then there's some that are, 50. I've seen 50-page leases before that I'm just dumbfounded as to why you would need so much verbiage to stipulate the relationship. But again, there's ultimately a reason why that's in place. But if you could elaborate a little bit on some of that, I think that'd be helpful.
Sure. I think that oftentimes business owners might tend to focus on maybe too heavily on base rent and just the term or the duration of the lease. Maybe not pay as much attention to other things. Some of the monetary terms that I think sometimes fly under the radar are, kind of the share of the operating expenses or real estate taxes that might be passed on to the business owner. Sometimes they include things like capital improvements to the property, which are typically, really should be landlords' expenses, or, building up landlords' reserves for, a rainy day or something like that. And, that's typically not part of the general day-to-day maintenance of the property. So I would try to exclude that, on the tenant end. Also, I guess late fees and charges, there could be, it could be a lot higher than than tenants would like. Sometimes there are other things that might not necessarily be what you would think of as being a default under the lease that might trigger additional fees that people should look out for. On the non-monetary terms of the lease, I think one of the big ones would be the ability to assign the lease. Like if you're a business owner and if you get to the point where you would like to sell your business to someone else, or maybe just some of the assets, like the lease, the ability to assign would be very important. And a lot of times we will try to include a permitted transfer set of provisions where you can assign it to an affiliate of your business or to a parent entity, or in the event that you're selling the business, we want it to be able to go to the successor entity, whoever purchases your property. We want to be able to assign the lease without getting the landlord's approval, because ultimately they're going to be on the hook. There might need to be some sort of carve out, like maybe their net worth might have to be equal to your net worth or higher. But there are ways to do this where you won't necessarily trip up your other side of the transaction where you're trying to sell your business.
Definitely. No, for sure. I couldn't agree more on that front, especially the assignment piece. I run a lot of times into clients that, especially those who are just getting started, where they think the world of what's going to happen. They're going to, expand and do all these different things, but they don't realize that it's always good to kind of have a backup plan just in case, especially in the subleasing part of things, like having the flexibility to do that is important. And obviously the co-tenancy piece, because I'm in the retail space, so, I'm sorry, not co-tenancy, but essentially restricting the uses on site sometimes, in particular on shopping center deals. Because if you don't want to be located next to a liquor store, if you're a liquor store owner and, you're in a shopping center and then the tenant or the owner tries to put in another liquor store right next door, that's not going to be good for business. So having some restrictions, or at least just having a discussion about what that looks like, is something I've come across in my end. And obviously I'm not a lawyer, so I definitely did not negotiate any type of, verbiage or anything like that. But these are just some of the things that I saw as well on my front. So
I actually just, earlier this last week, I think to your point, permitted uses or restrictions on the use are key. I was reviewing a lease earlier this week where it was for like an oil change, like a Jiffy Lube type of business. And they had a provision in there saying that tenant is not allowed to do anything that directly or indirectly that may result in, hazardous materials contaminating the property. I'm like, well, that's pretty odd having it for an oil change facility, because you can have, trace amounts. Yeah, I know it's probably not what the landlord meant, but that's what was stated in that old lease.
Yeah, no, 100%. And sometimes, and again, it's probably not the greatest thing in the world, but some people, when they come up with these commercial lease agreements, it's just like a template. So they don't really have a commercial real estate attorney review the lease to make sure that it in fact is encompassing exactly what they want to do. And I've seen some lease templates where I'm like, you definitely just printed this off, online somewhere, and like just kind of use it as a cookie cutter thing, because you don't want to have to worry about trying to spend an extra however much to get the lease organized in a way so that it actually accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish. So, but yeah, it's definitely good insights that you shared pertaining to that. So one thing I also wanted to share is, obviously that's more of the business owner and tenant side, which is a big part of the commercial real estate business. But the other side is also the ownership. So we have a lot of people here that are either representing owners in the leasing of property, and or they're owners themselves, and they're looking to secure tenants in their buildings. And so I thought, I'd kind of give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the items that, landlords don't really consider as they're looking at properties to fill. So.
I think first off, I think you mentioned this earlier, but just having a good form of the lease. I mean, I think typically you want to treat tenants generally the same. You might tweak a few things here and there, but you want to have, for each property, I'd say you'd want to have one form that you use for all of the general form that you use for all the tenants at that property. And if you're the one preparing the form, so typically you want a lease that'll be landlord friendly to start off with, and then you can negotiate it to however whatever the tenant will agree to. I'd say another consideration, and it sounds pretty basic, but you wouldn't believe how often we see it, but we want to make sure that the tenant is a validly existing entity that is registered in the state that the property is located in. You want to make sure that you actually have created legal obligations. If the person signing or the entity signing the lease doesn't exist, then you can't really go after them in the same way if they don't uphold their end of the lease. Another one I somewhat mentioned earlier, typically property owners will have financing on the property, trying to leverage and increase their their cash on cash return. That oftentimes lenders will have leasing requirements in their loan documents, sometimes affecting the duration of the lease. You want to have your debt to income ratio being above a certain amount. Oftentimes they'll affect how much rent you can charge. Typically, none of the leases are allowed to have any rights of first refusal to purchase or any sort of purchase options. That way, the lender is protected because they know that you're not able to really freely get rid of your asset. Also, they're going to want to have specific. I guess they're going to want to have to give consent regarding any sort of modification or changes to certain key tenants, like above a certain square footage, or just anchor tenants if it's like a shopping center. You want to keep the lenders happy, otherwise you'll risk running default on your loan. And that's important because if you default on the loan, obviously they can foreclose, but they can also accelerate the rent. Accelerate the loan payments, so you're paying it all up at once, which is pretty scary if you're talking about a multi-million-dollar loan. Those are some of the. Oh, and also another one I could think of. Obviously, picking tenants is very important. Raphael, you mentioned earlier having maybe some sort of, might want to consider offering certain tenants exclusivity rights to be the only pizza shop or the only whiskey bar, or bourbon tasting. That's big in Kentucky. I just worked on one where there was a bourbon bar and on one end of the premises, and then there was like a brewery that opened up, or a sports bar that opened up right next to it, and we had to specifically negotiate a sports bar, you're allowed to sell maybe one or two types of bourbon, but this is the exact brand and the exact line that you're allowed to sell, so we don't run afoul of that. So you really definitely want to have a mix of tenants that will kind of symbiotically direct increase traffic flow or foot traffic to your establishment.
Definitely no. And you mentioned the lender piece. How closely do you review some of those mortgage documents? Because I imagine, like you said, you mentioned the lender provisions and the covenants that you have to follow in order to make sure that the loan is essentially compliant over a period of time. So how closely are you working to evaluate, what provisions exist within that those mortgage documents?
Sure. I basically every time I'm drafting a lease, I have to turn back to that loan agreement and go through to make sure that, typically, I mean, all we need to do is ask the lender for consent. But, if there are enough things that I could tell that the lender's concerned about, that'll, they may come back with comments. And oftentimes, these are large institutions. So oftentimes they can be slow, or things can get lost through the cracks, or it has to get to the desk of the right person. So it can add weeks to a lease negotiation where you've worked out your basic deal terms with the realtor like weeks ago, and the attorney may have sent out the draft of the lease a couple weeks, a week after that, or 3 days after that. But sometimes getting lender approval can take time. So if as a property owner, if you kind of know, or if you ask your attorney like what the loan agreement says, like which types of leases will need lender consent and which just need notice, that would be really helpful, because that would help you kind of streamline how you're going to market the property, market what duration of the lease, market the rent. Sometimes they might have some permitted use kind of restrictions. So that the more you can streamline that, the better. I'm sure, as a business owner, you'd also want your tenants to be signing quickly, and they're going to want to sign quickly on their end too. So anything to streamline the process. So I'm looking at loan agreements every day.
That makes sense. No, that's good to know. And obviously that's, like you said, it's an important part of making sure that you're working within the confines of what is actually needing to be done in order to make sure that the property performs as intended, and also that you're complying with all the requirements that the lender put forth. So that's a great advice. So one of the questions that I had, which again, there's people on the call and, that are watching this on YouTube and various other platforms that are in a variety of different property types. And commercial real estate is not just the commercial office buildings. It can include retail centers, as we've kind of discussed. It can include industrial buildings. It can include multifamily, even as you start scaling above 5 units. So, can you touch on a little bit about some of the nuances between the different property types, and then, maybe elaborate a little bit on, some of the things that you think would are beneficial depending on what property type you're focused on?
Sure. I guess for multifamily, typically you're dealing with residential leases, and varies from state to state, but typically residential tenants enjoy greater rights and protections than commercial ones do. So it might make them harder to evict if they're not paying. And I guess oftentimes there are also punitive damages if you as a landlord improperly eject a tenant. So I think it might be easier to run afoul of landlord tenant laws if with that type of asset. For industrial, I think hazardous materials is often a major concern, especially if the space is already somewhat contaminated. Who's going to clean it? Do you even need to address it right now? If hazardous materials is a big one. Oftentimes a tenant's build out of a space might be more, more specialized or more specific to that particular tenant. So if you're not able to get the tenant to, restore the property to its white blocks or vanilla condition, it might be harder to remarket the property, or someone's going to have to pay to restore it. So if whether it's the landlord or the tenant, there's going to be some assignment of the risk either way. I guess for office spaces, those are typically, I don't know, I feel like there often aren't too many different concerns. I know that there are, the common areas you want to be attractive, stuff like parking, elevators. You want to make sure that the HVAC system is running during business hours, and oftentimes that's negotiated because it takes a lot of energy to run those things. Sometimes though, like for medical offices, you need to they have certain security requirements for storage of records because of HIPAA. Sometimes that's something that would need to be kind of worked out, but offices tend to be a little easier. But for retail, especially for a shopping center, we've mentioned those exclusivity or provisions before. You definitely don't want to have two tenants in the same place offering the same types of service. So that can be a bigger concern there.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And you start getting into those, and you do this for all property types as well, but the lease abstracts that you guys create are pretty, I mean, they could get pretty elaborate. So definitely important work that you guys do for sure. So All right. So one of the questions I wanted to ask before we open up to Q&A, just so you guys know that if you guys are tuning in for the first time, we actually open up to Q&A so you guys can ask your questions. And obviously we're located in Kentucky, so I'm sure there's some questions that may be very, very specific to your state or municipality that Brian may not be able to answer specifically, but I'm sure there's certain things that Brian can definitely answer as more of a general term. But again, we just want to make sure that you guys have an opportunity to ask any questions you guys may have. So but before we do that, I wanted to ask, so if someone's interested in learning more about, commercial leasing process, especially as it pertains to the things to consider, what are some of the best resources out there, do you think?
Sure. Well, if you're looking for space, I would definitely speak to a commercial agent like Raphael. But if you're just interested generally, there are a lot of books and videos and podcasts out there. But I would say that I've learned the most about leasing just by reading actual term sheets and the actual leases that come from those term sheets. I know it's harder to get your hands on those, but if you have a friend who's currently leasing commercial property, or I would recommend asking them, just see if they give it to you, maybe after redacting certain financial terms and stuff like that. But if you could kind of just see how it's structured, kind of see hey, if I know my friend's business, like they are they sell cars or something, these are some of the things that they have in their lease, or that's something that may not really apply to them, or I think just kind of reading through different types would really kind of expand your knowledge.
Absolutely. And if you guys are in the brokerage space and you operate in a brokerage where, you have a residential arm and a commercial arm, you never know. Maybe you could ask, the broker on the commercial side to see if you can get access to some of these templates just to review and kind of get familiar with that process. And like Brian said, I mean, attending some of these either meetups or other types of national organizations that are focused in commercial real estate, a lot of times you'll be able to gain access to relationships that you can leverage to get some of this information as well. So I know you guys are you involved in any organizations in particular, Brian, that are commercial real estate focused?
I'm still new here. I haven't branched too much, but I did want to try. I did want to visit Cree at some point soon when work slows up a little bit.
Yeah, and that's
Cree is another big commercial real estate group here in Louisville.
Yeah, and there's actually it stands for Commercial Kentucky Real Estate Exchangers, but there's real estate exchangers groups all across the country. So and I know this because I did some research on it, and it's a lot of times I think here locally you have to be licensed, but you come together and it's just literally people coming together to talk about different deals and creative ways to be able to solve problems when it comes to commercial real estate deals. So maybe an organization worth checking out. So. All right. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to open it up to Q&A. So if you guys have any questions in particular, feel free to type away in the chat box. We do have almost 80 people on the call, so I just wanted to make sure that to streamline it, it's easier just to type it out in the chat box, and then I'll respond. So, all right. So we had one question related to may I record this or is it available later? No. So we are recording this as well. So if you guys want to refer to this at a future date, you will have it available, and I will actually post the video in the group, LinkedIn group, once it's all said and done. So, all right, I'll check our live stream as well, just to make sure if anyone has any questions in particular. Tara, I think you had a question. Are you typing away? Okay, sounds great. All right. Good. So we have one question coming in. So it looks like in light of the pandemic, what new lease provisions have become more relevant to tenants and landlords? That's a good question.
Sure. One thing I saw, I don't see as much now, but I definitely saw, I guess earlier in the pandemic, a lot of people were amending the so-called force majeure provisions, where if anything really unusual act of God situation like riots, often did not say global pandemic, or or if there are governmental like regulations that affect the running of business, or if there's a labor strike or even war. I think a lot of times the provisions often have war in it. Then certain obligation, a lot of obligations under the lease are kind of forgiven or kind of postponed. I guess in light of the pandemic, there's been a greater push to add those sorts of considerations, but also, just any time that the government may just kind of shut down business or prevent you from operating, to the force majeure section. And then also related to that provision, also kind of clarifying that you may not have to like perform any construction obligations or, those, actions, but you will still have to pay. So you might not have to do whatever it is now, but you're still going to have to keep paying rent. So that's something landlords push for. That's always something that tenants push back on. And, depending on everyone's bargaining power, you kind of shake out in the middle somewhere.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a, I think it was a Supreme Court ruling, or maybe not a Supreme Court ruling, but there was a high level ruling pertaining to the force majeure clause early on in the pandemic. I remember reading about it because there were a lot of tenants across the country that were trying to invoke that provision to, essentially not have to pay rent. And there was a big battle, obviously, across the nation that people are saying landlords are obviously on one direction and, tenants are in the other direction. So I remember reading an article a while back on that. So.
And to that point, I think a lot of people ended up, a lot of landlords ended up kind of just taking the rent that would have been due in the early months of the pandemic and kind of spreading out the rent throughout the remainder of the term going forward. I know that was a popular way of handling that.
Definitely. All right, so we have one question. I think you alluded to riot damage. So in a scenario of riot damage, who's that typically covered by? And I'm sure that's obviously it depends, but
I would say really would depend on the insurance coverage and type of the lease too. I mean, a lot of times, the owner would have their own property insurance. Sometimes when I say it depends, sometimes, if it's a triple net lease, oftentimes they'll have the tenant kind of take care of that. But it would really depend on your insurance coverage, and I would hope that it would cover that.
And what
level you.
Yeah, and obviously talking to a commercial insurance broker in particular would probably be a good point to do so, because that's another thing. We had another gentleman come on several 2 months ago, I think, that was a commercial insurance broker, and he talked about the nuances of commercial insurance, because a commercial insurance policy can be as skimpy as a $1 million general liability policy, and then you can start getting really granular in what is actually being covered. And so getting advice from someone who actually does this on a day-to-day basis, and they read these policies and get an understanding of what the risks are involved with your enterprise is going to be crucial, because what's specific for a meat processing plant for coverage is going to be completely different than what a bike store is going to need. So it's like, there's talking to a commercial insurance agent is probably going to be your best bet. So Tara, hey Tara, she says, what's the best way to break into the commercial real estate market as a realtor? I have associates in the commercial. I have associates in the commercial sector. How can I approach them for the opportunity to sit in and learn? Everyone looks for experience. Great question. Yeah. And I can even touch on that. If you're looking to get in the brokerage side, that's what I did. I actually came from a tech background. I'm an engineer by trade. I was a software consultant, and then got into the brokerage space. And interestingly enough, Brian's wife had done a deal with my broker. And so actually that's what enabled me to, I had met Jessica through networking, and I just kept telling everyone, I was like, hey, I want to get into commercial brokerage. I want to get into commercial brokerage, and just kind of let people know that that's what I wanted to do. And lo and behold, people are like, oh, I know someone who's in there. And they just kind of made introductions. And, I interviewed with 4 or 5 different people, or not even interviewed, just to grab coffee with people. And, you're not always going to fit everywhere. Like I didn't fit with like several people that I met with, just personality wise and, goals, et cetera. And then ultimately I met with my broker, and we just kind of hit it off. So it's one of those things where the more people you talk to, the more people you tell about your interest in getting in, I think that's going to actually ultimately lead to success. And obviously leveraging LinkedIn is huge. So look in your local area, send messages to people online that you think are doing some cool stuff in your city or municipality, and then just try to grab coffee and, again, just talk. talk. And those opportunities present themselves.
Nowadays, everyone's just a Zoom call away. So,
Oh yeah,
world's your oyster.
yeah, exactly. And that's, yeah, Joanna was referencing that as well. So she said that's the same thing. So, all right. So Robin, hey, Robin, she says, or he, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I don't want to be incorrect on that, but they said, I'm a newbie developing mixed use project, grocery anchor on the first floor with 3 levels for loft apartments above. What are the main issues for me to consider leasing and otherwise?
I think I guess the first level of consideration that I would think of is typically for mixed use, it would depend on kind of the ownership structure. I mean, as the developer, you can kind of develop it as a condominium where you're selling off pieces of the building, like you have an actual deed that you are giving to I guess to the purchasers, and they will own the box basically floating in the air of those spaces. And there are residential condominiums. There are also commercial condominium units. And if you are having a condominium where you're actually giving the other person title, it is best for a developer to set the ground rules through, I guess, a covenant of a bunch of restrictions kind of filed against that, kind of creating like the condominium board, which would create kind of like policies for the whole building, kind of balancing the residential and the commercial aspects of that. If you're not going to be selling the portions to the actual, and you're just going to rent them out, it's a little bit easier in that regard. But yeah, I think that'd probably be my main concern, just starting off with the actual building, and that could take time to develop.
Absolutely. And then Joanna mentioned noise restrictions and stuff like that, and that also falls in, like you said, the covenants for the building, or covenants, conditions, and restrictions for developers and stuff. And when you're dealing with residential versus commercial on the bottom, I'm sure there's nuances versus if you just have like a complex that would include offices and retail and whatever. So
right, but I personally, I love mixed use developments. I think it's a very efficient use of space. Definitely growing in popularity. So
yeah, and I'm sure you did a lot in New York. You mentioned the residential high rises and stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's those mostly are mixed use. I mean, especially if you're incorporating retail or some other storefront in the bottom floor. So
very much so. Actually, I recently sold my co-op apartment. I know co-ops are less common in most areas of the country, but to give you a sense of how interestingly structured my building was, there were maybe about 250 residential units as part of the cooperative residential corporation. That was the large. My whole building was a condominium technically, with 6 or 7 different units. The largest unit was the residential housing corporation, but then there was also a parking garage unit. There were several retail storefronts on the first floor, which were each 2 or 3 different units. And then there were a slew of professional offices in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors. So I guess collectively, they had a condo board, for the business owners and the residential people all together. And it was very interesting kind of seeing the financials, basically as a residential property owner, I didn't see much common charge increases, because a lot of that I think was, the building was kept afloat, I think, by a lot of the commercial owners.
Oh, absolutely. And co-ops are interesting too, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but with condos, like you own whatever's inside your walls, but with co-ops, it's like a fractionalized interest within the property. Is that correct? Or
it was kind of weird. I owned it was like 0.03% of the whole building or something, or rather of the housing corporation. But then so I had a stock certificate, like I owned part of the company. And that stock certificate gave me the right to have this lease to apartment 1525. And so I was technically their tenant, even though I was also a an owner, a part owner.
Shareholder. Yeah,
There you go.
exactly. That's awesome. All right. So Pon asks, can you talk about a typical lead time for lease negotiations and finalizing the lease agreement from start to finish? I know this varies by property type, but he'd like to elaborate a bit.
Sure. I mean, I think, and this really will go to the, I guess, it really depends on how much you have fleshed out the initial term sheet, when working with your realtor. I mean, I know oftentimes, especially with my REIT clients, they won't send me a term sheet until pretty much everything's been hammered out. Like I might think of a couple things that need to go back on, but the more fleshed out it is, typically I could just send out a draft of a lease, and tenants will just sign it. If there needs to be some back and forth, I've seen some go on for 2 or 3 weeks. And it also kind of depends on how long it takes attorneys to review it and send back. But I think doing a lot of the work on the front end would really, really expedite the process. And like I mentioned before, also, whether or not this lease needs lender approval, that could be big. That can set you back weeks as well, even though you have everything ready to go. You've really just about finalized the lease, but you're just waiting on lender's consent. That's definitely something to consider.
Definitely. No, some great advice. All right. So we had a question. Can a tenant opt out of LTA? Do you know what I don't know the acronym.
I'm sorry. Yeah. What do you mean by LTA?
Yeah. That's a good question. In the meantime, what I'll go ahead and do is I'll move to the next question, and then we'll come back to that one as well. But if you don't mind kind of specifying the acronym, I think that'd be great. So Missy asks, is there a preference on which platform to use for any particular type of property in regards to Crexi or LoopNet, or any other suggestions you recommend? So yeah, I guess that's more listing for properties. Yeah. So
probably more your end, Raphael, than mine.
Yeah. And just through my experience, and again, we're located in Louisville, and for other cities it may be different, but we've been leveraging Crexi a lot more than LoopNet. From my understanding, LoopNet is actually owned by CoStar. So a lot of the the listings that you put on there, unless you have a CoStar subscription, or I think LoopNet has a separate subscription, but unless you pay to play, essentially, they're not going to distribute the listing to every party out there. It's only going to be people who actually can sign in to LoopNet, and LoopNet's free. So if you log in, you can see all the listings. The thing is with LoopNet, from my experience, is that a lot of those listings are old. And so sometimes you look at it and it's like, this thing's been off the market forever, and it's just the data is not super strong. And obviously Crexi, we've been leveraging a lot recently, and we have our local commercial MLS in Louisville called KCREA, and so that's kind of the main point. And then obviously, because we've been in a lot of more people interested in looking at Louisville as an investment opportunity, we also project on Crexi as well. And obviously the bigger brokerages in town use CoStar, LoopNet, whatever. So it depends on which brokerage you're at. If they have a subscription, I'd encourage you just to post it. It doesn't hurt. So
I think,
right.
So I still don't really know what LTA is, but it might be that it's something related to the operating expenses, or something that's passed off to the tenants. I guess just to speak a little bit more on that, as when I represent tenants, I would, there are ways to kind of limit that, just kind of limit that exposure. I think one, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but you can kind of limit what counts as specifically exclude certain items from operating expenses or pass-throughs. The other things I didn't mention, you can implement a base year concept. So, kind of typically the calendar year that you've signed the lease, you're not going to pay any operating expenses for that year. But whatever that amount is, you go the next year, okay, 2023, you're going to start paying whatever the difference is between the expenses in 22 and 23. Or you're paying your share, whatever your percentage of the square footage is of the property. You can also consider capping the increases in so-called controllable expenses. And, typically, that could be, it covers all of the operating expenses, but, typically what's not controllable are, real estate taxes, insurance premiums, there are some other big items like that, but you can try to limit the rest of it and cap it at like, say, 3% every year increase or 5%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I've seen a lot of times with the increases for rents, sometimes they'll specify the actual percentage, and then sometimes they'll reference the CPI, and then sometimes to what you're referencing, they'll say not to exceed X percentage. So it really just depends. And obviously in this environment we find ourselves in, with inflation being what it is, I mean, some of those CPI leases are, the tenants are kind of kicking themselves right now because they're like, oh man, we're going to get an 8% jump next year, or however much based on the CPI. So, it's definitely something to consider. And there's obviously nothing you can do as an individual, but you have to consider the fact that, there have been high inflation times in life. And so, factoring in, if you're a tenant, you can get like a set amount that increases every year. I would encourage you to try to just get that, as opposed to tying it to some sort of index. So
I agree. I think from what I'm seeing on the term sheets, I rarely see a CPI, I guess, structure. I think, I don't know how negotiations were before they came to me, but I would suspect that most tenants, just really are not willing to take that risk given the environment we have right now.
Yeah. No, a lot of the leases that I've seen tied to the CPI were older leases, because we're acquiring a shopping center or something, and that just going through the leases and it's tied to this consumer price index, and I'm like, okay, well, the tenant's going to be in for a rude awakening here. So, and obviously it's all negotiable and stuff, but something to consider. All right. So we had a question. What, if any, federal statutes or regulatory framework is relevant to an attorney entering the commercial leasing area of law?
Okay. I guess just a couple off the top of my head, just off the cuff, just kind of non-discrimination of people, just based on their protected classes. That's across the board in all businesses. But another one that I see often, two more that I often see. We talked about hazardous materials and kind of the federal regulations that kind of define what those are. And two, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that's often very highly negotiated in build outs. Tenants will want the landlord to say, to represent that the premises are ADA compliant. Landlords will kind of try to deny that, but or not deny, but they don't want to make that representation. And it can be expensive to make that compliant.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I one of our good friends is in the commercial construction space, and making, there's a lot of nuances to making a space ADA compliant. And as you start getting into multi-story buildings, it could get pretty pricey, especially if there's no elevator in place and all these other things. So a lot of expense can be. So Joanna, she asks, I think she was referring to the expenses. So one thing so could you specify exactly what you meant by how long term, Joanna? I think I may have I forgot. You go ahead. Yeah. Solar panel leases are becoming more popular. Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think she's referencing the length of leases, and you're right. I mean, there's definitely there's some leases out there too that are like obviously land leases. I'm working on a land lease deal right now. We're looking at a 20-year with 3 10-year options, so 50 years total. There's cell phone tower leases that are very long term as well. I've seen billboard leases that are extremely long, that sort of thing. So I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on some of that too, Brian.
I guess for personally, I haven't handled any solar panel leases. I know that they are getting more popular, but given the length of them, I would assume that they are, I guess, similar to a ground lease or a land lease, where you're actually recording that lease in the county clerk's office, because you want everyone to know that that you have rights to be on this property. It's not like a typical 5 or 10-year lease. Like most of those leases say you can't record it, because if the property owner goes to sell the property, it's going to come back as another title defect. But typically like long-term leases like that are you'd expect to find on your title report.
Absolutely. And I'll even mention on the ground lease side, because I've learned a lot more since I've been doing some of this work, is that, especially if you're looking to do a ground lease and then develop something on top of it, a lot of times the lenders will want you to have certain provisions in place to ensure that if something were to happen and you default, that they can assign your interest in the property itself to another party. And there's other provisions that you need to talk to lenders about. And they'll say, look, without these provisions within the lease agreement, we're not going to give you a loan. So, that's something I've learned about. And, and also think about when you're dealing with ground leases, you own the structure, but as soon as the lease is up, it reverts back to the ultimate landowner. And so, there's definitely reasons why this could be valuable, especially if it's like a parcel of land that's like super, it's like a phenomenally located parcel of land, and you can make back the investment tenfold by holding it for 50 years. And maybe it's a prime retail location, et cetera. That could be a reason why ground lease may be attractive. And, obviously you don't have to come to the table with as much from a down payment standpoint, because you don't have to worry about buying like the land itself. You're just leasing it. And so, the down payment requirements to acquire a property or to develop a property tends to be lower as well. So there's reasons why you would want to do a ground lease, but again, there's nuances to it. And that's why you need to talk to a lender. You need to talk to a real estate attorney to make sure you understand what you're doing. Industrial leases, for those, are considered commercial, right? Industrial. I am the attorney in AZ. Oh, okay. Nice. Well, AZ, nice. So actually I went to school at ASU, and, I lived in Arizona for many years. Yeah. Yeah. Go Devils, I say. Yeah. Awesome. So I think Carly was mentioning how LTA was Landlord Tenant Act, it looks like. So
yes, I don't think you can get around that. It would seem like a gross kind of conflict in public policy to be able to do that, and courts to allow that. So unfortunately, I mean, there are some areas or some states that might be maybe particularly tenant friendly, and as a landlord you might not want to deal with that. But I think maybe it just might be harder to select tenants on the front end that you think you won't have issues with, because they're still going to be protected by that Landlord Tenant Act, whatever state specific actual name it is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Good advice. All right, I think we have time for like one or two more questions. So if you guys have any in particular, I'll check the live stream as well. No more questions? All right. Well, I guess I'll ask you one final question. Do you wish, I guess, what do you wish I would, like a question that you think is important or pertinent that I didn't ask you that you think would be of value to the audience? And again, it if you don't have anything in particular, it's fine. And it's not a, yeah.
I don't know if I have anything in particular, but I mean, I do think that commercial real estate's very, very interesting. There's obviously lots of different asset classes, and I know especially now with a lot of fluctuation in the market, a lot more people are interested. In the stock market, a lot more people are interested in real estate because it feels more tangible. You can see a building go up or go down. I think it's a great time to learn more, and I know Raphael puts a lot of good content out there, and I know there are others like him too. So now's a good time to learn.
Definitely. No, I couldn't agree more. And, obviously we're honored and thankful to have you come on and share your insights. I know the audience gained a ton of value from your discussion. If people want to learn more about you and maybe get in contact with you, if they wanted to, hire you or whatever the case may be, what would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk. My email address, and maybe we could post this later after the fact, but my email address is blee, B as in Brian, Lee, Lee, at stites.com, stites.com. And my phone number is 502-587-2081.
Absolutely. And what we're going to go ahead and do as well is, since we're recording this, we're going to include this in the description. So if you guys are watching this on YouTube, it's going to be in the description. If you guys are listening to this in a podcast format, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, it'll also be in the description as well. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. We're always glad to see you all. Remember, we do this on a bi-monthly basis. So every other week we have speakers that come and talk about this on a regular basis. And yes, we will be emailing this out to people as far as the recording is concerned. It will be available in a video format, which we will post on the group. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next time. See you
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.